At the exact moment someone dies, something changes in the environment. It is not only the heart that stops, it is not only the brain that falls silent. There is an absence that can be felt even when the body is still there. If this is true, then we need to ask a question that almost no one has the courage to ask. What actually leaves the body when life ends? Today you are going to explore a possibility that could completely change your relationship with death. Because if something truly departs, then you are not merely temporarily organized biology. You are something that uses biology. And in the next few minutes, you will explore a possibility that can transform your relationship with fear, with attachment, and with your own identity. By the end, you may never look at a body the same way again. All of us have stood before a body that no longer responds. The face remains the same, the hands are still there, the form is intact, yet something essential is no longer present. There is an absence that cannot be explained merely by the stopping of biological processes. It is not only the heart that has stopped, it is as if the very presence has withdrawn. This perception is not religious, it is human. And it is precisely this absence that we need to investigate with courage and depth. The dominant definition of our era claims that life is the result of organized biochemical processes. Cells interact, neurons fire, electrical impulses travel through complex networks and produce behavior. When these processes cease, we officially declare that life has ended. This explanation appears solid, rational, and scientifically secure. However, it completely ignores the most mysterious phenomenon of human existence, which is subjective experience. The feeling of being conscious is not externally observable. It is not a physical structure. It is lived internally. If life were merely biological activity, then the difference between a living body and a dead body would be purely functional. Yet anyone who has witnessed death perceives that the difference is deeper than that. There is a quality of presence that disappears, and that quality cannot be reduced to electrical impulses. But this is only the beginning. When we reduce life to biology, we transform consciousness into a side effect of matter, as if thoughts, emotions, and identity were merely complex secretions of the brain. This view is based on an assumption that is rarely questioned. The fact that there is brain activity during conscious states does not prove that the brain produces consciousness. It only demonstrates correlation, and correlation is not causation. If you damage a radio, the music stops in that device. That does not mean the radio created the music. Perhaps the brain is a modulator, not the origin. Perhaps it organizes, filters, and translates something that already exists beyond it. And now comes the part that almost no one considers. If consciousness is not created by the brain, then its absence from the body does not imply destruction. Observe your own experience right now. Can you point exactly to where your consciousness is located? Does it occupy a specific physical point inside the skull, or is it simply presence? The feeling of being someone does not seem like a substance compressed within a three-dimensional space. It feels broader, more fundamental, and more difficult to define. When you close your eyes, consciousness continues. When the body is still, the inner experience remains. This suggests that consciousness may not depend exclusively on physical activity in order to exist. If this is true, then perhaps we have been confusing instrument with origin, and perhaps the body is not the source of consciousness, but its temporary interface. But there is something even deeper. If life is not merely biological activity, then our definition of death must also be reconsidered. We declare death when the body stops functioning, yet we have never deeply investigated what happens to subjective experience. Science measures vital signs, but it does not directly measure consciousness. It observes manifestations, but it does not capture the essence of presence. If consciousness is not visible, that does not mean it cannot continue beyond matter. It may simply mean that we are using limited tools to investigate something that transcends physical instruments. And that possibility completely changes the starting point of our question. One of the most provocative hypotheses that arises when we question the material model is the possibility that consciousness is not produced by the brain, but manifested through it. This difference is subtle, yet it completely transforms the understanding of death. Producing implies internal origin. Manifesting implies the expression of something greater. If the brain produces consciousness, then its failure implies the destruction of experience. But if the brain manifests consciousness, then its failure may only mean the interruption of expression at that specific point. Think again of the radio metaphor. The device does not create the music. It captures an invisible signal that already exists in the surrounding field. When the device breaks, the music is no longer heard there, but it does not cease to exist. This analogy is not definitive proof, but it is structurally coherent with the unresolved problem of consciousness. And now comes the part that almost no one considers. Perhaps we have confused instruma with origin for centuries. If consciousness is a field, then individual identity is not the source of experience, but a point of focus within something greater. Jung suggested that the psyche participates in a collective dimension, not confined to the isolated individual. This idea does not need to be accepted literally in order to be relevant. It indicates that the mind may be more expansive than we imagine. If consciousness is not contained within the brain, but the brain acts as a modulator of a deeper reality, then death ceases to be annihilation and becomes a shift in tuning. The instrument shuts down, but the field remains. This does not eliminate the human pain of loss, but it alters its ontological interpretation. And this changes everything, because if the field continues, then what leaves the body is not something fragile, but something that simply ceases to express itself in that specific form. Observe your conscious experience again. Perception does not seem confined to a rigid physical point. It appears as an open field of experience within which thoughts, emotions, and sensations arise. When you close your eyes, consciousness does not disappear. When the body is still, inner experience remains active. This suggests that consciousness does not depend exclusively on physical movement to exist. Perhaps the body is merely an interface for interacting with the material world. Perhaps it is a kind of lens through which the conscious field temporarily focuses itself. But there is something even deeper. If the body is a lens, then death may simply be the moment when the lens dissolves while the light remains. If we accept this hypothesis, even provisionally, the central question transforms. It is no longer does consciousness end, but where does the focus of consciousness shift? If it is not created by matter, then its withdrawal from the body does not imply extinction. It implies transition. This leads us to completely reconsider what we understand as an end. Perhaps we have been interpreting death from within a limited model of reality. Perhaps we have been trying to explain something non-local using local tools, and that possibility opens space for the next layer of investigation. Reports of near-death experiences appear in different cultures, distinct eras and varied contexts. People describe sensations of expansion, absence of pain, heightened perception of the environment, life review, and encounters with a luminous or deeply loving presence. These reports should not be blindly accepted as definitive proof of the continuity of consciousness, but neither can they be automatically dismissed. What stands out is the structural consistency of these experiences, even among individuals with different beliefs. Many report mental clarity at moments when the brain was clinically compromised. This description raises an uncomfortable question for the traditional materialist model. How can structured experience occur when the biological instrument is failing? But this is only the beginning, and now comes the part that almost no one considers. Many of these reports include a clear sensation of separation from the physical body. People claim to perceive the environment from an external perspective, as if the point of view had shifted. This change in perspective is described not as a confused dream, but as an intensified state of consciousness. It is not merely disorganized imagination, but structured and coherent perception. Even if we adopt a skeptical stance, we must recognize that these reports challenge the idea that consciousness depends exclusively on bodily integrity. At the very least, they suggest that the relationship between brain and consciousness may be more complex than we assume. Another recurring aspect of these reports is the sensation of continuity, of identity. People do not describe immediate dissolution into nothingness. They report remaining themselves, still aware of their history and their essence. This is deeply relevant to our central question. If consciousness were merely a chemical product of the brain, we would expect its interruption to lead to immediate erasure. Yet human testimony points toward expansion, not absolute void. This does not close the scientific discussion, but it expands the philosophical horizon. And it forces us to consider that perhaps we are interpreting incomplete data with limited models. If these accounts contain even a fraction of experiential truth, then we must seriously consider the hypothesis that what leaves the body is not merely generic life energy, but the very center of conscious perception. Perhaps death is not the interruption of experience, but a change in the state of experience. Perhaps the focus of consciousness simply ceases to operate through biology and begins to operate in another way, and that possibility leads us directly to the deepest question of all. Perhaps death is not the extinction of consciousness, but the extinction of the connection between consciousness and the physical body. This distinction is crucial. Because if the body is merely a temporary interface through which consciousness experiences the material world, then its failure does not necessarily imply the destruction of consciousness itself. Think again of the radio example, but deepen the metaphor. When the device stops functioning, the sound disappears at that specific point in space. Yet the transmission continues to exist in the invisible field around it. The silence of the device is not the death of the music. It is only the end of reception. If the body is instrument and consciousness is field, then death may simply be the moment when the instrument falls silent. And now comes the part that almost no one considers. Perhaps we are confusing local silence with absolute non-existence. If death is disconnection rather than destruction, then identity is not confined to the biological structure that temporarily expresses it. This does not mean denying the human suffering of loss, but it does mean reinterpreting its nature. Pain exists because the physical interface no longer responds. Communication through the body ends. The form we recognize no longer interacts with us. But the absence of interaction does not prove the absence of consciousness. It proves only that the material form is no longer operating. And this forces us to reconsider what we understand as an end. If consciousness does not depend exclusively on biology to exist, then what leaves the body may simply be the focus that was anchored in that specific form. But there is something even deeper. If we accept, even provisionally, that death is disconnection, then the very idea of time must be linear. Time is an experience mediated by the body. It is perceived through the physical sequence of events. If consciousness ceases to operate through the body, perhaps it also ceases to operate within the same temporal limitations. This means that what departs may not be subject to the same coordinates we know, and that possibility radically alters our understanding of continuity. We are not speaking of material permanence, but of experiential continuity at another level of reality's organization. And this hypothesis is more coherent with the mystery of consciousness than the automatic assumption of annihilation. If death is disconnection and not an end, then what truly leaves the body is the conscious point of view that animated it. Not as a physical substance escaping, but as a shift in perceptual state. The body remains as biological structure, but the presence that made it someone specific is no longer there. The identity that spoke, thought, and felt ceases to express itself through that interface. And perhaps that identity was never the property of matter, but only a temporary visitor. This idea does not end the investigation. It expands it. Because if what leaves the body is consciousness in transition, then we must ask something even more radical. Where is that consciousness operating now? And that is precisely the question that leads us to the deepest existential implication of all. If death is not the end, but a disconnection, then the fear that silently governs much of our choices begins to lose its grip. Much of human anxiety is born from the assumption of absolute annihilation. We live as if we are racing against an implacable clock that will one day erase everything we are. That sensation shapes our fears, our attachments, our need for control. But if consciousness does not end when the body fails, then the narrative changes completely. What we call an end may simply be a shift in perspective. This does not eliminate the pain of separation, but it alters its meaning, because if something continues, then death is not the destruction of identity, but the transformation of the mode of experience. And that possibility changes the way you live now. If you are not merely the body, then your identity is not confined to appearance, age, or physical condition. You are not only your memories, nor only your biographical story, you are the center of experience that uses all of this as instrument. This profoundly alters the way you perceive suffering, aging, and loss. If consciousness continues beyond the physical interface, then every moment lived here gains another dimension. It ceases to be the only opportunity to exist and becomes a phase within something greater. This does not reduce the value of life. On the contrary, it deepens it, because living ceases to be mere survival and becomes expansion of consciousness. And now the most intimate implication emerges. If death is not the end of consciousness, then the purpose of life cannot be merely to accumulate material experiences. The purpose may be inner expansion, maturation of perception, refinement of awareness. Perhaps the body is a temporary school. Perhaps matter is a laboratory for learning. If this is true, then what leaves the body is not a victim of entropy, but a traveler in transition. And this idea softens fear without eliminating responsibility. Because if consciousness continues, then everything you live now matters deeply, not as a final act before nothingness, but as a stage within a greater journey. But if something truly leaves the body when someone dies, then we must ask the question that almost no one dares to formulate clearly. Where is that consciousness now? Does it occupy some kind of dimension we have not yet understood? Or does it completely transcend the very idea of location? If the body is merely an interface, then what we are may not be limited to physical space. And if that is true, then the very notion of inside and outside may be illusory. Perhaps you were never inside the body in the way you imagine. Perhaps you have always been the field of experience that uses it. If this reflection awakens something within you, observe the feeling that arises now. Do not respond only with belief or disbelief. Observe your own experience. There is something in you that intuits it is greater than physical form. There is something that perceives perception itself, and that presence does not feel fragile. It feels fundamental. If you sense this, share in the comments which part of this reflection resonated most with you. Continue this journey with us. Subscribe to explore the next layers of this investigation, because if death is not the end, then we need to investigate something even more radical. If consciousness leaves the body, then where is it really? And if you are not inside the body, then where exactly are you now?